The early morning hum of the city hadn't started yet, just the low whir of James's ceiling fan and the faint groan of plumbing from the apartment upstairs. He sat at the edge of his bed, eyes half closed, feet flat on the floor, breathing steady, not out of habit, but out of preparation. There was a meeting today, one of those meetings, the kind where tension hangs in the air before anyone speaks, and words are chosen like weapons. James rubbed his palms together, not out of nerves, but strategy. He'd been reading something new, not a modern self-help book, not productivity hacks or mindfulness mantras. This time, he'd gone backward, way backward. The Art of War by Sun Tzu, a war manual written over 2,000 years ago, and yet, somehow, it felt more relevant than most emails in his inbox. The first line had stopped him cold. War is a matter of vital importance to the state. But James wasn't in a war. He wasn't a general. He sold insurance, wore button-ups, said things like "circle back" and "per our last conversation." But lately, everything felt like a battle. Not the kind with swords and blood, but with pressure, office politics, managing expectations, competing agendas disguised as collaboration. Every Zoom call was a battlefield, every email a move, every decision a risk. He took a sip of water and opened the book again. The next line read, "It is a matter of life and death, a road either to safety or to ruin." James had scoffed at first. Dramatic. But then he thought about his last big client pitch, how one wrong slide had almost cost the company a major contract, how one careless comment last month had triggered weeks of passive tension with his manager. Safety or ruin didn't have to mean survival. It could mean reputation, position, momentum. That's what this was about. Sun Tzu didn't preach violence. He preached awareness. That's what James was waking up for, not to battle others, but to outmaneuver himself, his ego, his reflexes, his assumptions. He scribbled a line in his journal. Every day is a battlefield, not of blood, but of clarity. At the office, the lights buzzed with their usual sterile indifference. He passed Cheryl at reception, nodded to Alan by the printer, and slipped into the small glass room labeled Strategy Suite, a name far too dramatic for what was basically a large fish bowl with whiteboards. The meeting was at 9 a.m. It was 8:37. He wasn't early out of habit. He was early for positioning. Sun Tzu had written, "He will win who knows when to fight and when not to fight." James sat down, laid out his notes, and placed a bottle of water within reach. Then he did something subtle. He chose the seat closest to the whiteboard, visible, active, central. He didn't plan to dominate the meeting. He planned to frame it. That was the lesson. Win before the conflict begins. Prepare the field. Set the tone. By 9:05, the room was full, the air tight. Brian, the regional manager, was already scowling at his tablet. Lisa tapped her pen too quickly. Someone's phone vibrated against the glass table. James spoke first. Not with solutions, with a question mark. "What's the biggest risk we're not talking about?" Silence. Then Lisa glanced up. "I guess Client churn? James nodded once. What else? By 9:10, the tone had shifted. It wasn't an ambush anymore. It was a strategy session. James wasn't leading the charge. He was shaping the terrain. In The Art of War, Sun Tzu wrote, "The skillful leader subdues the enemy without fighting." James wrote that down months ago and taped it inside his notebook. Today, it came alive. He didn't win the meeting with dominance. He won it with preemption. As the discussion progressed, he noticed Brian leaning in. Lisa stopped tapping. Even Alan, usually silent in meetings, chimed in with a smart observation. The team wasn't reacting. They were aligning. James realized something as he listened. In every conflict, the first battle is against confusion. If you can clear the fog, you shift the momentum. He thought about how often people jumped into action without understanding, without preparation, without knowing the terrain, literal or emotional. Sun Tzu called that suicide. Know the ground, know the weather, know the enemy, know yourself. James had shown up early to know the ground. He'd studied past client notes to know the terrain. He'd read between lines in Slack to understand the team's stress points, the weather. He didn't see his coworkers as enemies, but he knew this. Every meeting had its emotional combatants: insecurity, ego, control, defensiveness. Understanding those meant understanding the field. The meeting ended with clear next steps, less friction, and, maybe for the first time in weeks, a sense of momentum. James walked back to his desk slowly, the clack of his shoes on the tile syncing with the rhythm of a realization. You don't need to win every moment. You need to choose the right ones. Sun Tzu had called it selective engagement, fighting only when the advantage was certain, avoiding action when unprepared. Later that afternoon, a coworker pinged him. "Hey, how did you stay so calm in that meeting?" James didn't say it was because he'd been practicing the philosophy of a 6th century Chinese general. Instead, he typed, "I just prepared like it mattered." He paused, then added, "Because it did." That night, James sat by his window, city lights flickering in the distance, and wrote in his notebook again. Victory starts in stillness, in seeing the terrain before charging, in setting the terms before they're set for you. He looked up at the sky, calm, quiet, but never passive. That's what the art of war was teaching him, not to attack, but to understand. Not to fight harder, but to fight smarter. And more than anything, to realize that most battles aren't won with strength. They're won with strategy. The rain came without warning, a hard, sudden downpour that hammered against the windows like a call to attention. James stood at the edge of his kitchen, mug in hand, watching droplets race down the glass in frantic streams. He didn't mind the rain. In fact, he welcomed it. Rain reminded him of disruption, and lately that word had taken on a new meaning. He'd read something in The Art of War the night before. In the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity. He'd underlined it twice, because yesterday, after the meeting had gone unexpectedly well, James found himself thinking about the next battle, not the one with others, but a one inside his calendar, his priorities, his time. He wasn't losing hours anymore because of laziness. He was losing them to noise. Too many tasks, too many messages, too many browser tabs open, both on screen and in his mind. And what did Sun Tzu say about this kind of battlefield? The clever combatant imposes his will on the enemy, but does not allow the enemy's will to be imposed on him. James sat down and opened his laptop. Before emails, before Slack, before the algorithm could start tugging on his brain, he pulled up his calendar. It looked like a war zone. Back-to-back calls. Project deadlines stacked like dominoes. A quick glance at the color-coded chaos told him the truth. He wasn't in control of his time. It was in control of him. He reached for his notebook and wrote a single line. If you don't set the strategy, someone else will. Sun Tzu had warned of this, not in those exact words, but in every principle. A leader must command the field, not just respond to it. James clicked open the first meeting invite for the day and smiled bitterly. It was a call he didn't need to be on. Just one of those vague calendar holds with no agenda and a dozen attendees. He declined it. No apology, just clarity. Then another and another. By the end of 10 minutes, he'd freed up 2 hours of his day. It felt like reclaiming land. James called this practice his mental terrain mapping, his way of scanning the battlefield of modern work and asking, what is useful? What is noise? The noise looked like urgency, but it was just clutter. And clutter, in Sun Tzu's world, was dangerous. He who occupies the field of battle first and awaits his enemy is at ease. James would occupy his time first. He created a new block in his calendar, strategic window. No meetings, no calls, just time to think, not react. Think. He had read in the book that ancient generals would study the shape of the land before a battle, sketch it, walk it, imagine how the enemy would move. James couldn't walk a battlefield, but he could map his day the same way. He sketched 3 boxes in his notebook. 1. Must win. 2. Guard and hold. 3. Delay or avoid. Into the first box went a major proposal due Friday. Into the second, a client relationship he needed to maintain but not obsess over. Into the third, a list of things he could let slide, LinkedIn scrolling, Slack banter, the meetings that only created meetings. That was his terrain. He paused. This felt different from productivity, different from time blocking. This was strategy. James realized something else. The enemy wasn't always a person. Sometimes It was diffusion, dilution, the slow erosion of intention by convenience. He stood up, walked over to his kitchen counter, and deleted 3 apps from his phone. Not forever, just for now. He didn't need to scroll. He needed focus. Sun Tzu wrote, "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles." That stuck with him. What if the biggest win today wasn't accomplishing more? What if it was defending your clarity? At 10:30 a.m., Alan knocked on the glass wall of his cubicle, holding 2 coffees. "Peace offering," he grinned, handing one over. "Sorry I was short in yesterday's meeting." James accepted it with a nod. "No worries." He meant it. Sun Tzu had said, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." But sometimes the enemy wasn't people. It was tension, miscommunication, ego. James had walked into yesterday's meeting not to defeat Alan, but to de-escalate the situation before it needed to be diffused. He didn't respond to Alan's frustration. He redirected it. This, he realized, was managing energy, emotional war in disguise. And the win? It didn't look like dominance. It looked like alignment. After lunch, James walked to a nearby bookstore. He didn't need anything. He just wanted to clear his head without a screen. The quiet shelves, the muted jazz playing in the background, it reminded him of Sun Tzu's other insight. Move only when you see an advantage. Do not advance simply because you can. James had always been a starter, quick to say yes, quick to take on more. But lately he was learning that silence was a move too. Pausing was not hesitation. It was calculation. He bought a small notebook and labeled it Situational Strategy. Inside, he wrote 5 prompts. What am I assuming that might not be true? 2. What am I reacting to instead of responding to? 3. What terrain am I overlooking? What is urgent versus what is essential? What battle is worth fighting today? It wasn't a journal. It was reconnaissance. James didn't want to get better at reacting. He wanted to get better at seeing. That night, after a quiet dinner and a long walk, he wrote one more note on a sticky square and placed it on his laptop. It read, "Let others be busy. I'll be strategic." He didn't need to match their pace. He needed to master the terrain. And as the rain returned, tapping again on the glass, James smiled, because for the first time in a long while, he wasn't overwhelmed. He was aware. And in war, awareness was the real beginning of power. The morning fog clung to the street like a secret, low and hushed, as if the neighborhood itself were trying to stay quiet. James stepped outside in his hoodie, hands buried deep in his pockets, breath curling in the cold air like soft smoke. He liked mornings like this, no edges, no urgency. He crossed the street toward the park and noticed something he hadn't seen before. A small footpath hidden behind a row of hedges, half covered by leaves. Curious, he turned. The path wound gently downhill, away from the main road, away from the routine. It felt less like walking and more like recon, an exploration of unknown ground. And that's when the thought returned. All warfare is based on deception. That line from The Art of War had unsettled him the first time he read it. He wasn't a liar. He wasn't manipulative. He didn't scheme. But Sun Tzu wasn't talking about fraud. He was talking about misdirection. And James began to realize just how much of his own life had been manipulated, not by others, but by expectation, by autopilot, by the illusion of importance wrapped in urgency. Deception was everywhere. The urgent emails that didn't matter, the high-priority tasks that led nowhere, the dopamine-fueled cycle of checking his phone and calling it productivity. He had been deceived by himself. Sun Tzu had written, "When able to attack, appear unable. When near, make it seem you are far away. When far, pretend to be near." James read that again last night, and it hit differently. It wasn't about war. It was about leverage, control over perception. How often had he walked into meetings broadcasting stress? How often had he over-explained, overshared, overcorrected, trying to prove something that no one was even questioning? He thought about his manager, Brian, hard to read, always composed, never rushed. Brian never overspoke. And yet he always left the room with authority. Appear weak when you are strong, and strong when you are weak. That wasn't deceit. That was design. James reached the end of the trail and found himself behind the park's baseball field. Empty stands, faded bases, stillness. He sat on the lowest bleacher, phone still tucked away. Today, he would try a new kind of practice. Tactical silence. He wrote the phrase down in his situational strategy notebook and underlined it twice. Too often he filled the space, answered too fast, jumped in too soon. But what if silence was his strongest play? He remembered a moment last week during a client call. Lisa had paused mid-sentence, unsure how to phrase something. Normally, James would have jumped in, helped her finish her thought, bridged the gap. But that day, he'd stayed silent. And in the pause, Lisa had found her own clarity. The call moved forward, stronger, cleaner. Silence was not absence. It was pressure, a presence that demanded intention. Sun Tzu had called this the economy of energy. The victorious strategist only seeks battle after the victory has been won. James stood and stretched, rolling his shoulders back. He didn't need to rush into today's battles. He just needed to prepare in such a way that the outcome was already leaning in his favor before he even entered the room. He opened his notes app and typed a line. Win the day before it starts. Back at home, he glanced at his calendar. 2 calls, 1 presentation, 1 internal update. He paused. Which ones required action? Which ones required positioning? He prepared for the update first, not with bullet points or data dumps, but with narrative control. Instead of sharing metrics, he framed a story. Here's what we saw. Here's what we learned. Here's what we're adjusting. He wasn't reporting. He was guiding perception. James realized something crucial as he rehearsed his talking points. If you tell the story first, others react to your version of reality. But if you stay silent, they fill the silence with their own. In The Art of War, Sun Tzu explained it another way. Whoever is first in the field and awaits the coming of the enemy will be fresh for the fight. James wanted to be first, not loudest, just first. The update went well, not perfect, but intentional. He didn't fill the call with details. He left room for questions and answered only what was essential. And afterward, Brian nodded once, said nothing, and moved on. It didn't feel like applause. It felt like trust. After lunch, James returned to his desk and opened a browser tab he hadn't clicked in months. His resume. He wasn't updating it to leave. He was updating it to remember to see the arc. Progress wasn't always visible in the day-to-day. It needed perspective. That, too, was in the book. Know yourself, and you will win all battles. James added a section for skills, not just technical, but strategic. Framing conversations under pressure, mapping emotional dynamics in teams, managing presence in uncertain environments. He wasn't gaming the system. He was finally naming the moves he'd made invisible. That evening, after walking to the corner store for groceries, James sat on the couch and reflected on a thought that had been simmering all day. Deception isn't about lying. It's about control, not of others, but of perception. And perception begins inside your own thoughts, your own reactions, your own posture under pressure. He scribbled one more line into his notebook. The strongest move is sometimes no move at all. The rain hadn't returned, but the air still smelled like it might. James didn't mind. Some battles are fought in storms, others are won in stillness. And tonight his stillness felt sharp, like a sword that never needed to be drawn. The hallway outside the elevator echoed with the usual Monday murmur, the dull thud of dress shoes, the rhythm of keystrokes before coffee, the predictable script of small talk. James stepped out, nodded politely at the woman from HR he never quite remembered by name, and walked toward his desk. Today didn't feel like a battle. It felt like a siege. There was something different in the air, not dramatic, just tighter, more watchful. Whispers of layoffs, a change in leadership, people smiling thinner smiles, checking over their shoulders more often. James sat down slowly, logged in, and scanned his inbox. 14 new messages, 2 flagged with exclamation points. He didn't open any, not yet. Instead, he reached for his notebook and flipped to a blank page. At the top, he wrote, "Stronghold versus exposure," because that's what Sun Tzu had been talking about in Chapter 4. The skillful fighter puts himself beyond the possibility of defeat, then waits for an opportunity to defeat the enemy. It wasn't about winning every fight. It was about becoming undefeatable. And that was a different mindset entirely. James had spent most of his early career playing offense, taking initiative, volunteering for projects, jumping into conversations without fully reading the room. It had served him well sometimes, but other times he'd made himself a target without realizing it. Now he understood something deeper. Before you charge forward, build your fortress. That fortress wasn't a defense of fear, it was a structure of readiness. James opened his task manager and began reclassifying his projects, not by deadline, not by size, but by stability. He created 3 new categories. 1. Fortify. Actions that protected his value, clarified his contribution, or stabilized his position. 2. Observe. Areas of the business that felt volatile, shifting, unpredictable. 3. Engage. Strategic actions that offered upside, but only if he remained protected. He paused as he reassigned each task. Updating client retention slides, fortify, volunteering for an ad hoc marketing brainstorm with a new VP, observe, replying to the Slack thread debating minor policy changes, ignore. It was about choosing the ground. Sun Tzu had said it clearly. Invincibility lies in the defense, the possibility of victory in the attack. James had been doing both backward. He'd been chasing wins without first locking down the basics. So he paused. He reviewed his systems, his performance log, his work receipts, every project where his name lived on the files, every deck he had contributed to but never been credited for. He made a folder, named it Proof of Value. It wasn't vanity, it was armor. In war, you don't sharpen the blade during battle, you do it before. That afternoon, the CEO dropped into the company-wide Slack. Exciting updates in the works. Stay focused, stay flexible, appreciate everyone's adaptability, which meant nothing stable. James sipped his coffee, reread the message, and didn't react. He turned back to Sun Tzu's words, "The wise warrior avoids the battle." Sometimes the strongest move was not engagement, but consolidation. He closed Slack, opened a spreadsheet, and listed every part of his role that could be made bulletproof. Client-facing wins, automations he had built quietly, cross-functional insights he'd contributed but never claimed. He wasn't preparing for a fight. He was reinforcing his castle. By 3 p.m., The murmurs had become louder. Someone mentioned a reorg. Someone else said hiring was frozen. A director's calendar had mysteriously been blocked for the rest of the week. James didn't flinch. He'd already moved his most important files to a cloud backup, already scheduled a one-to-one with his manager on the calendar before panic turned to paralysis, already rehearsed how he'd frame his impact if asked to justify it. And then came the moment. A call from Lisa. "Can you hop on Zoom?" James joined. Camera on. Posture calm. She didn't look worried, just tight around the mouth, her voice clipped. "Quick heads up. There's chatter around some upcoming shifts. Not confirmed, just thought you'd want to know." James nodded once. "Thanks for the signal." He didn't ask who, or why, or what, because Sun Tzu had said, "Opportunities multiply as they are seized." After the call, James walked to the small window overlooking the loading dock. Rain had started again, light, diagonal, soft armor from the sky. He thought back to his college days, cramming for finals, trying to win by intensity. He'd outgrown that. Now he was playing a different game, not just outworking people, but outlasting them. He scribbled another line in his notebook. Be the last one standing without scrambling. That was the new goal. Not flash, not reaction. Readiness. ... Before heading home, he updated a file he hadn't touched in months. A personal SWOT. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. He reviewed it with fresh eyes. Strengths, systems thinking, cross-team empathy, message clarity. Weaknesses, oversharing, urgency bias. Opportunities, client renewal framework redesign. Threats, reorg, shifting leadership dynamics. He added a new category at the bottom, leverage, because that's what this was about now. Not defense for defense's sake, but the kind of preparation that lets you act when the moment comes. And it would come, because chaos always does. The difference is whether it surprises you or finds you waiting. That night, James sat at the edge of his bed, phone face down, news apps muted. The world didn't need to be watched every second. His systems were in place, his fortress was ready, and so he slept, not unaware of the battles to come, but unshaken by their arrival. The sky over the city was unnaturally clear, a kind of rare cloudless clarity that made even the messiest intersections look organized. James noticed it from his kitchen window, sipping from his mountain mug as sunlight angled across the counter. Today felt different. Not heavier, not lighter, just sharper. He flipped open his notebook, not to write, but to reread. Specifically, Chapter 5 of The Art of War, where Sun Tzu talked about energy. Not brute force, not chaos, but organized force, directional momentum. Control of a large force is the same principle as control of a few men. It is merely a question of dividing up their numbers. James underlined the phrase because lately everything felt like too much, not in the emotional sense, but in the logistical one. Too many requests, too many tools, too many priorities overlapping until they collapsed into friction. His brain wasn't tired, it was scattered, and scattered energy, Sun Tzu would say, is as dangerous as none at all. At work, the trend had shifted. People weren't talking about layoffs anymore. They were moving into performance mode, quietly. No announcements, just a sharp uptick in task updates, cleaner Slack replies, more calendar invites labeled strategy or alignment. People were realigning, adjusting, gathering force. James could feel it. He'd seen it happen in client meetings before. A lull, a confusion, and then someone introduces a sharp direction. Suddenly, the scattered becomes streamlined, like wind organizing into a storm. That was momentum, and that was what today would be about. James opened his task board and didn't sort by priority. He sorted by flow. Which tasks led into others? Which projects naturally built into each other? Where could he find sequence? He started connecting the dots, not as tasks, but as threads. Finalize renewal proposal. Preps him for client QBR. Update retention visuals. Sharpened for executive deck. Refresh reporting template. Feeds into future automation pitch. The power wasn't in doing more. It was in stacking energy. And it had landed, not with fanfare, but with precision. Later, after washing his dishes and resetting his workspace, he wrote in his tracker, "Sequence over hustle, indirect influence, direct control, created flow, not pressure," and one sentence in his journal. The most powerful work feels like music when you get it right. Silent, structured, and unstoppable. As he turned off the light, James smiled at the quiet. He hadn't pushed harder. He'd aligned better. And tomorrow he wouldn't wake up trying to move the mountain. He'd simply follow the slope he created today and let gravity do the rest. The office was unusually quiet for a Thursday. No one had brought in donuts. The usual group by the kitchenette, Alan, Lisa, someone from HR who were flowing inbox. Not the meeting invite with 12 people. Not the vague, let's align Slack messages. Those are surface-level distractions. The real fight? Influence and asymmetry. Sun Tzu had written, "Appear at points which the enemy must hasten to defend. March swiftly to places where you are not expected." In James's world, that meant showing up early in conversations others assumed would happen later. That meant sending a one-paragraph proposal before anyone had time to overthink. That meant offering clarity before confusion became the standard. He opened a tab and pulled up a Google Doc he'd quietly been building. Retention Pulse Framework, version 1.0. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't final. But it was early. And early ideas have leverage. James took a deep breath and attached the dock to an internal thread titled Pipeline Consistency Initial Draft. He didn't ask for feedback. He asked a better question. Where are we bleeding attention? That's where the weakness lives. And when you name the real weakness, people drop their defenses because it sounds like truth, not performance. Within 5 minutes, Lisa replied, "Yes, this, exactly where I've been losing time." Then another reply from someone in marketing, "This connects to a conversation we had last week." And just like that, James had reshaped the field, not by waiting for a meeting, not by building a perfect presentation, but by occupying ground before others even knew. It mattered. Back in the book, Sun Tzu had explained it with eerie simplicity. To be certain of taking what you attack is to attack a place the enemy does not defend. In a world of inbox noise and reactive work streams, attention itself was a battlefield. James had chosen his terrain. By lunch, a mini working group had spun up. No formal kickoff, no approvals, just momentum. And momentum, he'd learned, is a currency of its own. After grabbing a quick salad from the cafe downstairs, James returned to his desk and found a message waiting for him. Brian, his manager. "Nice work getting out ahead on this retention project. Let's talk more next week." No emoji, no exclamation mark. But James didn't need punctuation to understand the message. He'd struck first, not as aggression, as precision point zero. He wrote a single sentence in his situational strategy notebook. Don't attack what is strong. Flow toward what is loose. That's where influence lives, in the places no one is guarding, in the cracks beneath the obvious. Later that day, James joined a brainstorming session for a new client engagement model. The call was already in motion when he logged in. People talking over each other, ideas colliding like bumper cars. Normally, James would wait his turn. Today, he didn't. Instead, he typed in the chat, "What's the failure point we haven't named yet?" Silence. Then someone unmuted. "You mean like where our current approach is actually weakest?" James didn't answer. He didn't have to, because the question shifted the tone. Suddenly, the group wasn't layering solutions. They were identifying exposures. Sun Tzu's wisdom whispered again, "If he is secure at all points, be prepared for him. If he is in superior strength, evade him." This wasn't about outshouting the loudest person. It was about changing the terms of the conversation. James called it strategic redirection. Take the energy being wasted in defense and bend it. Redirect it toward the vulnerable space, the unspoken risk, the blind spot. That's where transformation actually begins. When the call ended, James leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling tiles. Today hadn't been stressful. It had been sharp, and that was the difference between offense and overextension. He opened his journal and wrote, repositioned the conversation, named the gap, not the fix, moved early, not loud. Then one more line. Speed doesn't win. Position does. The sun was starting to fade behind the buildings, and the office lights flickered on, sterile and flat. But James didn't feel drained. He felt calculated. And in that feeling, he understood something new. Power isn't about pressure. It's about choosing the point of impact before anyone else sees it. The weekend came, but James didn't treat it like an escape. It wasn't a break from the work week. It was part of the rhythm. He stood on his balcony, hands wrapped around a fresh mug of coffee, after water as always, and watched the city unfold slowly. A delivery van idling on the corner, a teenager jogging with uneven breaths, someone in a red hoodie tossing breadcrumbs to pigeons near the crosswalk. The world moved differently on Saturdays. Less force, more flow. James flipped open The Art of War, revisiting Chapter 7, where Sun Tzu turned his attention to one of the most overlooked but dangerous aspects of conflict: disorder in movement. In modern life, that translated to one word: rushing. There are roads which must not be followed, armies which must not be attacked, towns which must not be besieged. In other words, just because you can doesn't mean you should. James had spent years saying yes to everything. More projects, more meetings, more complexity. Because that's what ambition looked like. Full plates, full calendars, full inboxes. But Sun Tzu offered something different. Restraint as strategy, not avoidance, just discipline. He closed the book and opened his personal dashboard, reviewing the goals he'd set a month ago. A few were on track. Some had stalled. One, launching a new blog series, had become an open tab he never clicked anymore. It wasn't failure, it was a signal. James wrote in his notebook, "Withdraw from the battles that drain more than they build." He scanned the list. The blog, not now. The workout challenge with Alan, fine, but reset expectations. The side project with the cross-functional AI task force, disengage. He wasn't driving it, and that meant he'd just keep getting pulled sideways. He wasn't quitting. He was reallocating troops. Sun Tzu called this concept marching discipline, the act of keeping formation even as you move, especially under pressure. James remembered a phrase from the book: "Do not press a desperate foe too hard." He'd always interpreted that as a note on mercy, but now he saw it more clearly. If you overextend, even in a win, you expose yourself. And right now, James was dangerously close to overextending. He clicked into his calendar and began cleaning it like a battlefield medic. 3 meetings? Canceled. 2 tasks? Postponed or reassigned. 1 habit he'd been forcing, meditating for 20 minutes at night, trimmed to 5. Not because 5 was easier, but because 5 was sustainable. The rest was friction dressed as discipline. At noon, James walked to a bookstore 2 neighborhoods away, the kind tucked between a barber shop and a closed-down print shop. He wasn't looking for anything, just wandering. Inside, everything smelled like wood and quiet. He wandered between shelves, letting titles jump out on their own. Eventually, he stopped in front of a book about mountaineering. On the cover, a single climber stood at the edge of a narrow ledge, rope taut, the sky wide behind him. James opened it randomly. 1 sentence leaped off the page. If you summit too fast, you don't adapt to the altitude. He paused, closed the book. That's what Sun Tzu had been saying. Pace matters, not just to conserve energy, but to stay alive long enough to win. By 2 p.m., James was sitting at a cafe table, notebook open, writing freely. At the top of the page, where am I forcing forward instead of stepping smarter? His answers came fast. Prepping next month's client deck, even though no one asked. Trying to finish 3 books at once. Making his system beautiful instead of functional. Training like a triathlete when a walk would serve the same purpose. He drew a red circle around the word forcing. Then underlined this phrase: progress isn't speed. It's intelligent advance. That evening, he stayed in. No social plans, no scrolling, no self-imposed productivity push. Instead, he cooked slowly, chopped garlic with care, stirred with rhythm, ate in silence, not because he was being mindful, but because he was building form. Sun Tzu wrote, "Let your plans be dark and impenetrable as night, and when you move, fall like a thunderbolt." That thunderbolt doesn't come from hustle, it comes from stored power. And James realized that power isn't just physical energy, it's mental space. The ability to see clearly, to act cleanly, to know when to pause so that your next move lands with force, not friction. After dinner, he updated his whiteboard tracker, not with check boxes, but with insights. Removed 3 distractions, rescoped 2 projects, protected focus by declining noise. Then at the bottom, marched, didn't scramble. James looked at the clock, 9:41 p.m., and felt no pressure to stretch the night into a late hustle. The war wasn't tomorrow, it was always, and warriors didn't survive by grinding, they survived by choosing when to hold formation and when to strike. James stood in the elevator, watching the floor numbers rise. 3 dots, 4 dots, 5. He wasn't rushing. He was calculating. In his hand, a manila folder. Inside, the framework draft he'd quietly been refining for 2 weeks. Not because anyone asked, but because he knew it would matter soon. Maybe not today. Maybe not even next week. But soon. The elevator chimed. James stepped out, walked toward the glass-walled conference room and paused at the door. Inside, Brian, two directors, and a woman from finance he didn't recognize. They weren't expecting him. He wasn't on the invite. But he'd been asked to swing by if you have a minute. And that was all the opening he needed. Because Sun Tzu had taught him. It is a military axiom not to advance uphill against the enemy, nor to oppose him when he comes downhill. Translation? Choose your conditions, or don't engage at all. James entered with calm posture, no rush in his stride. He didn't speak, just offered a small nod and waited for Brian to finish his sentence. Then, with precision, he slid the folder onto the table. I've been mapping how client reactivation overlaps with retention decay. Thought this might help the revenue planning convo. He didn't explain, he didn't pitch, he placed the offering, then stepped back. Literally, let it land, let them decide how to engage. Because here's the thing, pressure breeds resistance, but presence breeds curiosity. Sun Tzu knew that. Move not unless you see an advantage. Use not your troops unless there is something to be gained. James waited. One of the directors flipped open the folder, eyebrows raised. Brian glanced at the graphs, tapped twice on the table and muttered, "Smart timing." James nodded once, said, "Let me know if it's useful," and left. 10 minutes later, as he returned to his desk, Slack pinged. "Brian, just teed up your framework in Convo. Strong play. Let's sync soon. No applause, no fireworks, just momentum." James leaned back in his chair and breathed. That's what Chapter 8 was about. Not attack, not movement, position. Understanding when to act and when to hold. Because Sun Tzu's words were sharp. The general who advances without coveting fame and retreats without fearing disgrace is the jewel of the kingdom. James reread that line the night before, and it hit harder than expected because he'd spent years chasing visibility, trying to be seen. But what if the real power wasn't in being noticed? What if it was in being remembered? He opened a new document and titled it Neutral Ground, When to Advance, When to Hold. It was just notes for now, his own working strategy. He split the page into 2 columns. Advance if you control the tempo, you bring new clarity, you've mapped the risk of resistance. Hold if you're emotionally charged, the field is unstable, you're unclear on motive, because not every silence needs to be filled. Not every meeting needs a contribution. Not every fire is yours to put out. Sometimes the real power comes from staying still when everyone else scrambles. Later that afternoon, a crisis thread spun up. Client escalation, billing confusion, 4 people panicking in Slack. James didn't dive in. He watched, read every message, timed his reply. Then, 14 messages in, he posted. This might simplify. Client was promised a legacy discount that finance didn't tag. Attaching last year's agreement now. Silence. Then, resolved. Thanks, James. That was it. He hadn't responded to win. He'd responded to neutralize. Sun Tzu had said, "The skillful fighter puts himself beyond the possibility of defeat." And that's what James was doing now. He was building a reputation not for noise, but for timing, for knowing ... That night he went for a walk with his sister. She'd just come off a tough week. 2 sick kids, work pressure, no sleep. "I keep feeling like I have to do everything," she said. "Like the second I stop pushing, everything falls apart." James nodded slowly. "Maybe stop pushing," he said. "Start reading the terrain." She laughed. "What does that even mean?" He smiled. "It means don't confuse motion with progress. Sometimes holding is the strongest move you've got." She didn't respond right away, but later, as they parted ways, she turned and said, "I needed that." James wrote it down that night. Most people think strength is forward, but sometimes it's downward, rooted, unmoving. On his whiteboard, he erased an old line, "Initiate before asked," and replaced it with, "Move when position favors movement, not before." That was the lesson of Chapter 8. Be brave enough to wait, disciplined enough to observe, wise enough to know that not every day is for fighting. Some are for watching, for placing the folder gently on the table and letting silence do the heavy lifting.